He had everything: fortune, power, $1 million company, and hundreds of people vying for his attention. But it only took a cruel betrayal and a devastating financial blow to transform that admired businessman into a bankrupt millionaire, alone and deeply humiliated, abandoned by everyone who once surrounded him. While old friends disappeared and his life crumbled among debts and shame, only one unexpected person decided to knock on his door when he no longer had anything to offer. And it was precisely the cleaning lady, the only one who stayed, who would completely change that man's destiny. Before hearing this moving story of fall, forgiveness, and new beginnings, subscribe to the channel and activate the bell so you don't miss the next stories that show how life can change when we least expect it. Renato Cavalcante didn't need to look at the clock to know the time. His body had learned over 30 years of ambition to wake up before the sun. At 5:40 in the morning, he was already on his feet on the 12th floor of his apartment on Alameda Santos, with a cup of coffee in hand and the city of São Paulo still covered by the grey mist that preceded the chaos of the day. Down below, the first buses were already cutting through the wet asphalt. Inside, everything was silence and marble, and the cold sensation that the world belonged to him. Renato was 52 years old, with broad shoulders that Italian tailoring made a point of highlighting, and grey hair that Vivian insisted on saying gave him an irresistible air of authority. Vivian. He thought of her as he adjusted his tie knot in front of the closet mirror. His wife was still sleeping in the room decorated by the most expensive architect in Itaim Bibi, between Egyptian cotton sheets and imported pillows. 10 years of marriage to a woman who smiled in the right places, who knew the name of every wine in the cellar, and who knew exactly how to move at a business dinner without him needing to guide her on anything. He liked that about her: the efficiency, the elegance, the way she completed the image he had built over 3 decades of uninterrupted work. Cavalcante Engenharia e Incorporações had offices in the heart of Faria Lima and projects spread across 4 states. Renato had started from zero, the son of a merchant from the interior of Minas who had gone bust twice before managing to stabilize. The boy who grew up without vacations and without an allowance had become the man whose name was engraved in bronze at the entrance of his own building. That was no small feat. That was everything. On the way to the garage, he greeted the doorman with a quick nod. He didn't know the man's name, he had never asked. The black Volvo was waiting for him with the driver already in position, and Renato settled into the back seat without taking his eyes off his cell phone. There were 7 messages from the financial director, 2 from the board, and 1 from Marcos Andrade, his trusted partner for 15 years. Marcos? The name evoked a solid, almost reassuring presence. It was Marcos who handled the most delicate contracts, who negotiated with suppliers, who knew every detail of the company's financial flows with a precision that Renato admired and that, honestly, he preferred to delegate. He was the strategist. Marcos was the executor. It was a partnership that had worked for longer than either of them could easily calculate. Marcos's message said only that he had arrived early and needed to review some numbers before the 9 o'clock meeting. Renato didn't reply. He simply put his phone away and looked out the window as the city woke up with its honking and its hurried prey. The office was on the 23rd floor of a glass tower that Renato considered the most honest symbol of everything he had achieved. When the elevator doors opened and he stepped into the still empty hallway on a Saturday morning, he felt that habitual and discreet pleasure of being the first, of always being 1 step ahead. But he wasn't. The reception was empty as expected. The main meeting room, however, had the light on. Renato noticed this by the reflection on the translucent glass of the dividing wall, and his pace slowed by instinct, without him yet knowing why. There was something wrong with the quality of that silence, as if the air were charged with information he had not yet processed. He opened the door. What he saw took only 2 or 3 seconds to convert into total understanding. Marcos was there, Vivian too, and the way the 2 of them abruptly pulled apart upon hearing the door, the way their bodies reacted before their expressions could adjust, said everything that words would never say with such clarity. Renato didn't scream. He didn't move forward. He stood still in the doorway with his leather briefcase in his hand, feeling something that wasn't anger yet, but something prior to anger, something that came from a deeper and quieter place, like the exact moment the ground gives way before you realize you were falling. Vivian said his name. Marcos said there was an explanation. Renato turned around and left. He crossed the hallway, entered his private office, closed the door and stood by the window for a time he could not measure. Down below, São Paulo teemed without knowing anything. Cars followed their paths, people walked, money circulated. And he was there, standing, with his tie still perfectly aligned and the world he had built piece by piece starting to crack beneath his feet without making any visible noise. It was only that afternoon, when he called his private accountant for a conversation that began as a precaution and ended as a revelation, that the real dimension of what had been done was exposed before him. It wasn't just a personal betrayal. It was an architecture of embezzlement, a meticulous construction of fictitious suppliers, inflated contracts, and disguised transfers that had been built for years, brick by brick, right under his eyes. The whole was of a magnitude that the accountant took almost an hour to explain, and even then Renato had to ask him to repeat the numbers because the first time he simply couldn't believe it. When the accountant left, Renato sat in the chair he had personally chosen in a furniture store in Milan, looking at the paintings on the wall, at the framed diplomas, at the photograph of the inauguration of the company's first major work, when everything was still promise and determination, and he thought with an almost cruel clarity that he had worked his whole life to build something that other people had decided, with all the calm in the world, to dismantle from the inside. Monday's meeting was the shortest in the company's history. Renato summoned the board, presented the data, and the expression on the faces around the table confirmed what he already knew. There would be no quick fix. Construction sites stopped, investors backed away, banks blocked credit lines. In less than 3 months, what had been one of the most respected development groups in São Paulo became a judicial recovery process that economic newspapers covered with that mixture of curiosity and lack of mercy characteristic of news about downfalls. The apartment was the second to last to go. The Volvo went first. Then came the other cars, the wine cellar, the furniture that the art buyer had recommended as a safe investment. Vivian was no longer there to see any of it. She had left the week following the day in the meeting room, with suitcases that someone had packed with an advance notice that Renato only realized later. The last item was the apartment on Alameda Santos, sold for a value that didn't cover even half of what he owed. With what was left, he rented a 1-bedroom apartment in Brás, in a building without an electronic doorman, with a window that faced a brick wall and a bathroom, where the faucet dripped with a regularity that he began to hate as if it were a person. Renato Cavalcante, who had woken up for decades on a 12th floor with the city at his feet, began to wake up in that stuffy room without knowing very well where to look. And that was, perhaps, the most difficult part of all, not the poverty itself, but the absence of direction that accompanied it. The man who always knew exactly what to do next discovered, in that Brás apartment with the low ceiling and the dripping faucet, that he knew nothing anymore. Brás was not a neighborhood that forgave those who arrived with pride. It was a place of people in motion, of noisy commerce, of loaded bags and loud conversations in the middle of the sidewalk, of restaurants that served the dish of the day for 16 reais and had televisions on the wall broadcasting programs that no one really watched. It was a place where no one stopped to ask you who you had been. Brás just moved forward and expected you to do the same. Renato didn't move. He stopped. In the first few weeks, the apartment became a kind of inverted cocoon, the kind that transforms nothing, only envelopes. He woke up late, something he had never done in his life, and lay looking at the ceiling with the feeling that his body had forgotten what it was for. The clothes he still had with some dignity were hung on the only available hanger in the bathroom, and the rest was pushed into an open suitcase in the corner of the room that functioned as an improvised wardrobe. The minibar that came with the rent hummed irregularly, as if it were also struggling to keep running. He stopped answering the phone in the 3rd week. The first to call were acquaintances from the business world, voices he recognized but had never called friends, who called with that mixture of poorly disguised curiosity and vague offers of help that would never materialize into anything real. Then came the journalists, 2 of them with genuine insistence. Then silence. Exactly the silence he had deep down expected. His mother called. His father, who was still alive and was 78 years old and in fragile health, also tried to make contact through Renato's sister. He didn't return any of those calls. There was something in that inability to speak to his parents that he didn't know how to name properly. But it had to do with shame, and it wasn't the shame of having lost the money. It was something else, older and deeper. The shame of having believed he was untouchable. The shame of not having seen what was happening under his own nose for years. The drinking came in softly, as it usually does. First it was a bottle of whiskey he bought on a night when the faucet was dripping with unbearable frequency, and the television only showed things that irritated him. Then it was another. Then he stopped counting the bottles and started counting only the days, and even that got confusing after a while. His body began to show it. His sleep became heavy and restless. His diet was reduced to bread and something that didn't need to be cooked, and his beard, which he had always maintained with the care of someone who knows appearance is power, began to grow without him doing anything about it. There was a market on the corner where he went once a day to buy the basics. The guy at the register was in his early 20s and served everyone with the same efficient indifference that Renato had practiced his whole life with people who had no power over his schedule. There was also a lady who sold coccinhas at a stall near the corner and who one day offered him one for free because, according to her, he looked like he needed it. Renato refused with more sharpness than he intended, and then 10 meters ahead, stood still on the sidewalk with the ridiculous feeling that he had refused the only genuine thing anyone had offered him in weeks. It was on a Tuesday afternoon, almost 2 months after arriving in Brass, that the apartment doorbell rang. He wasn't expecting anyone. The doorbell rang a second time with that specific persistence of someone who has no doubt that someone should open the door. Renato got up from the mattress with the effort of someone carrying something invisible, crossed the small hallway stepping on an empty bottle without noticing, and opened the door. On the other side was Conceição Ferreira. It took him a few seconds to recognize her, not because her face was hard to identify, but because the context was wrong, like when you meet someone outside the place where you have always seen that person, and the brain takes a moment to fit them in. Conceição had been responsible for cleaning his floor at the Faria Lima office for almost 6 years. A woman in her late 40s, dark skin, short hair held with a simple clip, who arrived at 7 in the morning before any employee, and who, when Renato arrived earlier than usual, was always there with the cleaning cart and a discreet greeting that didn't get in the way or demand anything in return. Conceição was facing him now with a metal lunchbox in her hands. She wore a wine-colored long-sleeved blouse and a fabric bag on her shoulder. She didn't seem surprised by his appearance, by the grown beard, by the wrinkled shirt, by the bottle that must have been visible through the gap in the door. She simply said good afternoon with the naturalness of someone fulfilling something they had already decided before arriving. Renato stood still. He didn't know what to say. Part of him wanted to close the door by instinct, out of shame, out of that reflex of the man he had been, and who still inhabited him like a haunted ghost. But he didn't close it. She asked if she could come in. He took a step back, which she interpreted as a yes. Conceição entered, placed the lunchbox on the formica table in the corner that served as a living room and kitchen together, looked around without making a comment on what she saw, and went to the window, which had been closed for days. She opened it. The air that came in smelled of the street and exhaust and fried food from the restaurant below, and it was the most real air Renato had felt in a long time. She went to the sink, turned on the faucet, washed her hands, took the trash bag that was overflowing in the corner, and tied it with the same silent efficiency with which she had certainly done that gesture thousands of times in different places. Then she went back to the table, opened the lunchbox and said she had made chicken with okra and rice, and that he should eat it while it was hot. Renato sat down. He didn't know what else to do. After a few minutes of eating, with the food going down in a way that revealed how much his body needed something other than bread and alcohol, he looked at her and asked, with a voice that came out raspier than he intended, what she was doing there. Conceição crossed her arms over her chest and answered bluntly. She had managed to get the address from a friend who worked at the notary office where the apartment sale process had been registered, and she came because, of all the people who had passed through that office in the 6 years she worked there, He had been one of the few who treated her like a person. There was no exaggeration in that, nor idealization. It was a simple and precise fact. When she arrived early and the two crossed paths in the hallway, he said good morning. When she cleaned his office in the presence of meetings, he didn't speak as if she didn't exist. Once, when she'd accidentally knocked over a pile of documents, he had helped pick them up without saying anything to anyone. Those small things, Conceição said, were not small for someone used to being invisible. Renato stared at the lunchbox for a long time after she finished speaking, and he felt, for the first time in many weeks, something that wasn't exactly relief, but was very close to it, the strange and uncomfortable feeling of being seen by someone who wanted nothing in return for what they were offering. Conceição didn't return the next day. She returned on Thursday, 2 days later, with a fabric bag containing a pot of soup, a package of starch biscuits, and an orange. She knocked on the door with the same rhythm as before, that knock without urgency and without shyness. And when Renato opened it, she entered with the naturalness of someone who had already established some kind of territory there, not the territory of property, but of presence. This time he had shaved, not all of it, but part. He had also washed the dishes that had been accumulating in the sink since her last visit, and opened the window before she arrived, which was a kind of gesture that neither of them commented on, but that existed clearly between them. They ate the soup sitting on either side of the formica table, with the window open, and the noise of brass filling the silence in a way that wasn't exactly comfortable, but was at least honest. Renato asked where she worked now. Conceição explained that she had been hired by a corporate cleaning and sanitization services company, which outsourced teams to offices and clinics in the Paulista and Paraíso region. She earned a little better than before, but the hours were irregular, and she had to take 2 buses to get to the team's collection point. Renato listened to all this without interrupting, which was, for him, something new. He had spent decades in meetings where listening was a strategic technique, a way to map the interlocutor before making a move. Here there was no strategy. There was only the account of a life that functioned within limitations he had never needed to calculate, and there was something in this listening that was strangely calming to him, as if the simple act of paying attention to something concrete anchored him to a ground that was until then disappearing beneath him. The following week she came 3 times, the week after 4. It wasn't arranged, it was the visit that simply happened, shaped by a logic that neither of them had verbalized, but that both recognized. Renato began to wait for her without admitting he was waiting. He cleaned the apartment before she arrived, with a care that was in fact a form of poorly disguised pride, the pride of someone who doesn't want to be seen at their worst by someone who keeps coming back. It was on a rainy afternoon in June that she found him in his most critical state. It had been a difficult morning, the kind of morning where thoughts circled with no exit, where shame and regret formed a closed circuit that led nowhere. He had been drinking since the morning, which was new even for the standard of those weeks, and when she arrived he was lying on the mattress with his eyes open and a bottle at the side of the bed. Conceição stood in the bedroom doorway for a moment. Then she entered, took the bottle, went to the kitchen, emptied what remained into the sink and returned. She stood at the entrance of the room with her arms crossed and said, with a firmness that wasn't anger, it was something else, something more serious than anger, that he needed to stop. Renato said it wasn't her problem. She said she hadn't made that journey twice a week to watch a capable man sink into a bottle. She said she had lost people to the bottom of a bottle before, that she knew how it started and how it ended, and that she wasn't willing to cross her arms in the face of it, not for him specifically, but because it was the kind of thing she couldn't do. There was a huge difference between being tough out of cruelty and being tough out of a refusal to abandon. It took Renato a few days to identify that difference in what she had said, but when he did, the phrase stayed with him in a way few things did. The following week he went to the CAPS, the psychosocial care center of the neighborhood. It wasn't out of conviction, it was out of a lack of a convincing argument not to go, which is sometimes enough. The psychologist who treated him was about 35 years old, had a notebook, and a patience that he initially read as condescension, and then, by the second session, recognized as genuine competence. He didn't tell everything in the first conversation, but he told enough so that something began to move in a place that had been still for too long. Conceição knew he had gone by the way he spoke that week. There was something different in the quality of the words, a certain openness that hadn't existed before. She didn't comment directly, but the look they exchanged over the Formica table said what needed to be said. It was during this period that Renato began to truly speak for the first time. Not about the money, not about the lawsuits, not about Marcos and Vivian, but about what was there before all that, about the boy from the interior who had arrived in São Paulo with a cardboard suitcase and the certainty that he needed to win or disappear, about how that certainty had become the engine of everything, and how that engine had run without rest for so many years that he had completely lost the notion that there was anything beyond speed. Conceição listened to him with the same attention with which she did everything, present, unhurried, without visible judgment. And sometimes, when he stopped in the middle of a sentence because emotion arrived before the words, she just waited. She didn't try to fill the silence, she just let the silence exist until he was ready to continue. One afternoon in July, she arrived more excited than usual. She had made a proposal to her supervisor for a new way of organizing the cleaning schedules in the clinics, and the feedback had been positive. Renato listened to the details with genuine attention and asked some questions about the logistics, about how she had calculated the times per environment. Her answers were precise, practical, organized with an intelligence that didn't need a title or an MBA to manifest itself. He told her that. He said that the way she thought about processes was good, better than that of many managers he had hired throughout his life. Conceição smiled. It was a brief smile, without vanity, that disappeared quickly, but left something in the air after it went away. Renato stared at that smile for a moment, and then looked at the window, because there was something in it that he still didn't know exactly how to name. But he knew it was real, which was already more than he could say about many things he had believed to be true for most of his life. The faucet was still dripping, but that afternoon, for the first time, he didn't notice. The job Renato accepted in August was not the kind of thing he would have ever imagined for himself. It was a position as an administrative analyst in a small construction company for residential renovations in Tatuapé, found on a job site by a chance that had more to do with desperation than planning. The salary was 4,000 reais, which was precisely the amount he had already paid as a tip to valets at business dinners without thinking twice. The interview was conducted by a woman in her early 30s who clearly recognized him by his last name, but had the common sense not to comment. She asked about experience in contract and supplier management, and he answered with the precision of someone who had spent decades doing exactly that on a much larger scale, but without mentioning the scale. She hired him the following week, probably because qualification of that level for that salary was a favorable equation for the employer. The first day was the most difficult, not because of the work itself, which he mastered with a naturalness that almost embarrassed him. It was because of the small room with 5 desks, because of the slow computer that loaded spreadsheets with a delay that tested his patience, because of the filter coffee that sat in a corner of the hallway and that everyone took with their own mug, something he didn't know. It was because of the secretary, a friendly woman named Dorinha, who called him Mr. Renato, with a respect that sounded like irony without her having the slightest ironic intention. It was because of the looks of his colleagues, discreet and lateral, the curiosity of someone who knows that this grey-haired man arrived from somewhere that doesn't match that small room. He survived the first day. He survived the first week. In the second week, he began to find his rhythm. And there was, Renato was discovering with a surprise he hadn't anticipated, something genuinely satisfying about working with small contracts, with neighborhood suppliers, with spreadsheets that needed manual adjustment because the system was old. There was a concreteness in this that the work of large numbers didn't have. Each contract represented a real renovation, a house that was going to change its face, a family that had saved money for years for that. He hadn't thought about this dimension before. He had never needed to. He told all this to Conceição on an August night, when she had stopped by after work with a pastel de feira wrapped in a paper napkin, and they had sat on the edge of the open window while the neighborhood cooled down with the end of the day. She listened and said that was it. That was exactly what he had lost back then, the contact with what things meant before they became just numbers in a board meeting. Renato said she spoke like a psychologist. She said she spoke like someone who had never had the luxury of disconnecting from what things cost. There was a frankness in her that disconcerted him sometimes, not because it was rude, but because it was absolutely direct without needing embellishment. He had spent decades in an environment where things were said in layers, where the real message was always below 2 or 3 surfaces of strategic cordiality. Conceição had no layers. She said what she thought with the naturalness of someone who had never needed to protect any position. He began to tell her about the judicial recovery process, which was moving slowly through legal channels without him having much control or participation. The lawyer representing him worked for a fee agreed upon when everything ended, which was a generosity that Renato had received with awkward gratitude. There was some hope of recovering a portion of the assets, but it was a calibrated hope, the kind you learn to have when you've already been too optimistic and know what happens when the ground gives way. In September, Conceição arrived one afternoon with a hardback notebook bought at a neighborhood stationery store and said she had an idea. She had thought about it for weeks and had decided that if she didn't say it soon, it would be kept forever. The idea was a consultancy, aimed at small and medium-sized companies that needed administrative organization, process flow, supplier management. The knowledge was Renato's. The organization, the operational discipline, the contact with the real world of costs was what she brought. There was no need for an office, not at the beginning. It could start with what they had. Renato stared at the notebook she had placed on the table. It was a 70-sheet notebook with a red cover, and she had already written a few pages in round, organized handwriting, sketching a basic structure, what services to offer, who the initial audience would be, how to price it. She had researched competitors. She had noted average market prices. She had even drafted a possible name. He took the notebook and read everything with an attention she observed in silence. When he finished, he looked up and remained for a few seconds without speaking. Then he said, there was a flow problem in her proposal. If they started without reserve capital, any delay in payment from a client in the first few months could compromise everything. They needed a minimum margin, a contingency plan, at least 2 or 3 guaranteed clients before any fixed commitment. Conceição smiled. She said that was exactly why she had brought the notebook, so that he could point out the problems, because she knew what she was planning, but she also knew there were things she didn't know yet, and that he did. Renato looked at her for a moment longer than he intended. There was something in that sentence, in the honesty with which she said, I don't know but you do, and so let's go together. That was so different from everything he had experienced in his professional and personal relationships that he needed a moment to reorganize himself internally. Then he looked back at the notebook and said, so the first thing we need to do is a real financial plan. She pushed the notebook closer to him, turned the page to a blank sheet and put a pen on top. And so it was, on a September afternoon in Brass, with a 70-sheet notebook and a borrowed pen, that Ferreira e Cavalcante Consultoria Administrativa began, without a sign, without a tax ID yet, without anything other than a man with knowledge and a woman with vision, sitting across from each other at a formica table with the window open, and the noisy neighborhood outside, doing what it always did, moving forward without waiting for anyone. The first client of Ferreira e Cavalcante Consultoria Administrativa was a small physiotherapy clinic in Ipiranga that had grown too fast and was now sinking into disorganization. The owner was a physiotherapist named Beatrice, who had set up the business with her own savings and who understood functional rehabilitation with admirable depth, but who confused cash flow with account balance and signed supplier contracts without reading the adjustment clauses. The contact had come through an acquaintance of Conceição, a woman who worked at the clinic's reception and who had mentioned in a casual conversation that her boss was desperate to organize the finances before losing a contract with a health plan due to bureaucratic delinquency. Conceição had called Beatriz that same night. Renato had prepared a proposal the next day in a 3-page document that Conceição had reviewed to ensure the language was accessible to someone without management training. The meeting took place in a clinic waiting room on an October afternoon. With Renato on one side and Beatrice on the other, over a table of stacked magazines that served as an improvised work surface. Beatriz hired them that same week. The fee was small, but it was real, and when Renato arrived home that afternoon and placed the signed contract on the Formica table, Conceição looked at him with an expression he hadn't seen anyone direct at him in a long time, a kind of shared satisfaction that was different from the solitary pride he had cultivated his whole life. They worked at the clinic for 2 months. Renato mapped the contracts, renegotiated with 2 suppliers, created a simple system for controlling receivables. Conceição reorganized the administrative agenda, created a service protocol for health insurance plans, and developed a routine manual that the reception could follow without depending on the owner's decision for every detail. Beatriz was so satisfied that she referred them to a colleague who had a language school in Sacomã. The language school came in November. The medium-sized restaurant in Ipiranga came in December, referred by the owner of the print shop located on the same block as Beatriz's clinic, who had heard about the work. In January, there were 4 active clients and a list of 2 waiting for a response. Renato had left his job at the construction company in December after an honest conversation with the owner, who wished him luck with a sincerity that moved him more than he expected. Conceição continued at the cleaning company until February, working in the mornings and dedicating her nights to the consultancy, which left her exhausted, but which she refused to treat as a problem before there was a real alternative. The alternative arrived when the revenue from the second full month of operation supported the 2 of them with a margin. That night, Conceição prepared a dinner in the Bras' apartment, the first real dinner the 2 of them shared, with a pot on the stove and everything, and they ate sitting at the same Formica table where everything had started, but which now had a fruit basket in one corner and a vase with a small plant she had brought on a visit weeks ago. Renato had asked for wine. Conceição had bought grape juice, and when he noticed the swap and stood looking at the bottle without saying anything, she simply said that wine was for when there was something to truly celebrate. And there was a firmness in that which wasn't judgment. It was care, the kind of care that knows someone's story and doesn't pretend it didn't exist. It was on this night that he realized there was something between them that wasn't just a partnership. It didn't arise like a lightning bolt, as he had imagined feelings arose when he was younger and more naive about the dynamics of emotions. It arose gradually like the tide that rises without one noticing until one's feet are wet. It was admiration. It was gratitude. It was the constant presence of someone who had chosen to be there when there was no external incentive for it. He said nothing that night, but he looked at her as she cleaned the table and told something about a call she had received from a former co-worker, and there was in that look something he didn't try to hide completely. She noticed. He knew she had noticed by the way she looked away later, not with embarrassment, but with that specific attention of someone who is processing new information and doesn't want to do anything before thinking properly. In the following months, the consultancy grew in a way that neither of them had planned exactly. One of the clients was a partner in a small gym chain in ABC Paulista, and the referral that came from there opened a different market, with larger contracts and more complex processes that Renato knew well. They needed to hire their first person, a young woman with a degree in administration who worked by project, and the experience of hiring someone and needing to be clear about what was expected, being an employer who respected what he had learned in the worst weeks of his own life, was something Renato took seriously, in a way he never had before. He had also resumed contact with his parents. The first call to his mother had been short and full of the specific silences of someone who has too many things to say and doesn't know where to start. But the second had been longer. And the third had ended with her crying on the phone and him looking at the ceiling of the Bras apartment with the feeling that something was being stitched back together, slowly and with irregular stitches, but being stitched together. His father had said in one of the conversations that he had always known the boy was intelligent, but that he had confused intelligence with invulnerability for too long. It was the most insightful thing Renato had heard from anyone in years, and it had come from the man he had almost abandoned out of shame. In March, Conceição arrived one afternoon with a craft paper envelope. Inside was a proposal for a small commercial space in Ipiranga, close to 2 of the current clients, with rent compatible with what the consultancy's revenue already supported. It was time, she said, to have a real address. Renato stared at the proposal. Then he looked at her, and he said with a calm that wasn't coldness, but the calm of someone who was finally secure on his own ground, that before signing anything about the space, there was another conversation they needed to have. Conceição crossed her arms and waited. And Renato Cavalcante, who had built empires and lost everything and found back only what truly mattered, said what had been kept since the night of the dinner, with the same directness he had learned from her, that he didn't know exactly when it had happened, but that what he felt for her wasn't gratitude. It was much more than that, and that he needed to know if she also felt something before they built another thing together without him having said that out loud. The apartment was silent for a few seconds. Conceição uncrossed her arms, looked at him head-on and said yes. That she had also noticed, that she had waited for him to say it first because he needed more time to get there, and she had learned, long before meeting him, not to rush what needed to grow in its own time. The faucet dripped once, then fell silent. The office in Ipiranga was 40 square meters, with a window facing the street, 2 new computers that Renato had researched for price and performance with the same care he once applied to million-dollar acquisitions, and a small sign on the door that Conceição had printed at a neighborhood print shop with the font she had chosen, after testing 16 different options on a Saturday afternoon. The sign said only FC Consultoria Administrativa, because at some point in the conversation about the name, the two had agreed, without either insisting, that Ferreira came first. The change in dynamic between them after the envelope conversation was, for Renato, surprisingly discreet. There was no explosion, no declaration repeated at every opportunity. There was a continuity, as if the conversation had only given a name to something that already existed, and that could now function without pretending it didn't exist. They continued working together with the same seriousness as before. They continued disagreeing about processes sometimes, which was healthy. They continued dividing tasks based on what each knew how to do best, without either of them needing to yield their identity for the partnership to work. There were also the meals. No longer lunchboxes brought to the door of a closed apartment, but shared lunches, dinners sometimes. The gradual discovery of each other's preferences regarding simple things. He liked strong coffee without sugar. She preferred tea at the end of the day. He was anxious with background noise when he worked. She functioned well with the radio on. He needed silence to think. She needed conversation to organize ideas before writing. These small maps of the other were, Renato was discovering, a pleasure he had not experienced in the 10 years of marriage with Vivian. With Vivian, preferences had been divided by function. She took care of certain parts of life. He took care of others. There was an efficiency in that, and there was comfort, but there was very little real encounter. With Conceição, there was encounter. There was the feeling that when he spoke, she was really listening. And when she spoke, he was discovering something he didn't know he wanted to know. In June of that year, an unexpected event tested the stability they had built. Marcos Andrade made contact. The message arrived by email at the consultancy office, addressed to Renato with the subject line blank. The text was short and careful, the text of someone who had rehearsed every word. Marcos said that he had ended his involvement with Vivian a few months ago, that he was sorry, that there were things that needed to be said in person if Renato were willing to listen. Renato read the email 3 times. Then he closed the computer and stared at the wall for a considerable time. Conceição was at the other table, her back to him, working on a report. She noticed the silence, turned her chair and asked what had happened. He showed her the email. She read it, returned the computer, and said it was his decision, and his alone, and that whatever it was, she would respect it. Renato didn't reply to Marcos, not that day nor that week, but the message stayed in his head like a forgotten object in the corner of a room. He knew it was there, and he knew that sooner or later he would need to decide what to do with it. The CAPS psychologist, whom he still met with every 15 days, said that replying or not replying to Marcos was less important than understanding what he needed from it. If he needed an explanation to close a cycle, the conversation made sense. If he needed a confrontation to release anger, there were other healthier ways to do that. If he was afraid of discovering details that would make everything worse, that was also a valid answer. Renato said he didn't know exactly what he needed. The psychologist said that was fine, and that this was almost always the honest starting point. At the end of June, he replied to the email with one line, that if Marcos wanted to talk, he could arrange a coffee. That he didn't guarantee what he would say or feel, but that he was willing to listen. The coffee took place on a July afternoon in a bakery in Paraíso, far from the neighborhoods the two used to frequent. Marcos had aged in a way Renato hadn't anticipated, not in years, but in a different quality, the aging of someone who has been carrying something heavy for a long time. His cheekbones were deeper, and there was a caution in his gestures that didn't exist before, in the man Renato had called a partner and a friend. Marcos explained bluntly, and without trying to present himself in a more favorable light than he deserved, what had happened. The involvement with Vivian had started earlier than Renato suspected. The financial issue had been Vivian's initiative, not his, but he had agreed out of a weakness he didn't know how to justify other than by saying he had lost track of who he was. He said he didn't expect forgiveness. He said he had returned to the judicial process everything he could, which wasn't everything, but it was what he managed to gather. Renato listened to all this without interrupting. He drank his coffee to the end. And then he said that he hadn't simply forgiven, because forgiving wasn't a switch. It was a process he was still in the middle of. But that he had understood enough so that the anger he had carried for months no longer needed to occupy so much space inside him. Marcos left the bakery 20 minutes later, and Renato stayed for a while longer alone with the empty cup. He thought about what the psychologist had said about cycles. He thought about Conceição, who at that moment was probably at the office reorganizing the agenda for the following week. He thought about the Braz apartment, which he had left the previous month for a slightly larger place in Ipiranga itself, with a window that faced a tree instead of a wall. He left the bakery in the late afternoon. The city was in that specific state of São Paulo when the day begins to yield to the night, with the sky the color of copper over the buildings and the traffic already congested, but still with a certain light that made everything a little less urgent. Renato walked a block before taking the subway, and in the middle of that block he stopped in front of a flower shop and looked inside without entering. Then he entered. He came out with a bouquet of sunflowers that the florist wrapped in craft paper that made noise when he walked. He took the subway. He got off in Ipiranga. He walked to the office, which would be closed at this hour, but which he had access to. Conceição had left a note on his desk, saying she had gone to visit a potential client in the neighborhood and would be back before 7. The note ended with a question mark about dinner, which was her way of asking without seeming like she was controlling anyone's agenda. Renato placed the sunflowers in the glass mug on the window, which was where she kept pens but would work for now, and sat in his own chair to wait. When she opened the door at 6:45 and saw the sunflowers in the window, she stopped. She looked at them, then at him. He said only that it had been a long day, and that it had gone well. She said sunflowers were her favorite flower. He said he knew, that she had mentioned it in a conversation weeks ago and that he had paid attention. Conceição stood looking at him for a moment, with an expression he was learning to read, that specific mixture of surprise and something that looked very much like the certainty of being exactly where she should be. Then she went to the desk, put down her bag and said, "So let's close the office and you tell me what happened at the bakery." And that's how the night began, and how the construction of something that neither of them yet had the completely right words to describe advanced, but which both recognized clearly when they were inside it. There was a part of Conceição's story that she hadn't told, not because she was hiding it with bad intentions, but because there are things you tell when the moment comes, and not before, and the moment for that had taken longer than she had expected. It was one of those truths that remain suspended, waiting for the right time to land, and which, when they finally land, slightly change the angle of everything that had been said before. The story began to emerge on an August morning, when a call arrived on Conceição's cell phone while she was in the office preparing a proposal. She looked at the screen, paused for a second, and said she needed to answer it outside. Renato didn't ask, but he saw her through the window, her back to the street, with the different posture of someone in a conversation that requires effort. She returned 10 minutes later with a composed expression but slightly different eyes. She said it had been her older sister, that there was a situation with her family in Maranhão that was complicating some plans she had made for the second half of the year. Renato said he could wait, that there was time. She thanked him with a brief smile and went back to the proposal. But the subject returned on a Friday night, when the two had stayed late at the office reviewing a report for the client from ABC. The hallway lights were already off, only their room illuminated, with the street noise arriving muffled. Conceição stopped in the middle of a sentence, closed her laptop and said there was something he needed to know. Renato placed his pen on the table. He listened. Conceição spoke for almost 40 minutes without interruption. She had grown up in São Luís do Maranhão, the daughter of a seamstress and a fisherman who had gone to São Paulo to look for work when she was 9. Her father had found work in civil construction, sent money for a few years, and then the contact had become sparse until it became absent. Her mother had raised her and her older sister alone, with the sewing machine and the neighbor's field. Conceição had arrived in São Paulo at age 18 with a factory bag and the address of a distant cousin in Brás. She had studied at night for years, first the elementary school she hadn't completed in Maranhão, then high school, and she had tried for 2 consecutive years the entrance exam for administration at a public college, coming close both times, but not enough. On the 3rd attempt, she had needed to stop to take care of her sister who had fallen ill, and after the money and the time, the entrance exam had been left behind. She had accepted this not as a defeat, but as life being what life is when you have no margin for error. But there was something more, and it was this something more that she had left for the end. In the years she worked at the Cavalcante Engenharia office, she had observed more than she cleaned. She had paid attention to what the real administrative work of a company looked like, to the conversations that escaped through doors, to the documents that passed through the office, to the meetings she heard in fragments. She had bought management books in downtown second-hand bookstores. She had taken 2 free online courses in basic finance and people management. She had developed in silence for years knowledge that no resume recorded, because there was no diploma to validate what a woman learns when she spends years paying attention instead of being treated as invisible. And there was something more still. In one of the last weeks before the company went bust, when the atmosphere in the office was already tense and whispered conversations multiplied through the hallways, she had witnessed something she had kept to herself without knowing what to do. She had overheard by chance part of a conversation between Vivian and a person on the phone in the hallway near the meeting room. It was night. She was collecting cleaning materials. The conversation was quick and coded, but she had understood enough to know that something was being moved that shouldn't be. She had stood still, parallel to the wall, with her heart racing, and she had left without saying anything because she didn't know who to tell, because she was just the cleaning lady. Because no one asks the cleaning lady to testify about what the owner's wife said on the phone at 8 at night. When she finished speaking, the office was completely silent. Renato stared at the desk for a long time. Then he looked up at her and asked the question that had stuck halfway down his throat. Why hadn't she told him this when she first went to the Brás apartment? Conceição answered with the same directness as always, because when she got there, the man she found was in no condition to hear any of that without it doing damage, because there was a time for everything. And because she didn't want him to think she had gone there out of some calculation for some position she wanted to occupy in what would follow. She had gone because she had gone, and she had kept the rest for when there was enough firm ground to land. There was also something else. And this part she said looking at the desk, not at him, which was unusual because Conceição almost always spoke looking at the person she was talking to. She had, at the time, recognized that what she had heard could have legal relevance in the process that would come. She had held on to it for months, weighing it. She had researched in the way she researched everything, reading, noting, understanding what she could. And then she had sought out the lawyer representing Renato in the judicial process and given an informal statement that, along with other documents found later, had contributed to part of the financial trail being tracked more efficiently. She hadn't told Renato this because she had done it before knowing him for real, when he was still to her just the man who had treated her with dignity, and because later, when she did know him, she hadn't known how to insert that fact into their story without it seeming like she was demanding something or asking for recognition for something she had done because it was the right thing to do. Renato remained silent for a time that was difficult to measure. Then he said he needed a moment. He got up, went to the window, stood with his back to her, looking at the street. The São Paulo night had that specific August temperature, dry and cold, with the wind coming through the corridors between the buildings. Outside, a bus stopped at the stop and let out a group of people who followed different directions with the particular hurry of someone who wants to get home. He thought of the morning he had opened the meeting room door. He thought of the months that had followed. He thought of the process that still ran, slowly, through legal channels. He thought of Conceição arriving at his door in brass, with a lunchbox in her hands, in a gesture he had interpreted as pure generosity, and it was that. But it was also, he now understood, the gesture of someone who had done more than show up, someone who had acted even before he knew he needed it. He turned around. Conceição was sitting in the same position, her hands on the table, her look direct now, waiting. He said he didn't know if he should be angry for not being told sooner or grateful for being told now. He said it was probably both things at the same time, and that there was a question he needed to ask before saying anything else. She waited. He asked if there was any other moment, any other detail that she was keeping. Conceição looked at him for a second. Then she said no, that had been everything, and there was in the way she said that a quality Renato had learned to recognize in her. It wasn't the clarity of someone defending themselves. It was the clarity of someone simply being true. He went back to the desk, sat down, and he said he was going to need a few days to organize what he was feeling, that this wasn't distancing, it was a process, and that he knew she understood the difference. She said she understood, and that she would be there when he was ready. They closed the office together in silence with the usual gestures of turning off the light and checking the lock. They went down the stairs. On the sidewalk, she went to the right, and he to the left, and it was the first time in many months that they said goodbye without arranging anything for the next day. But when he was about 10 meters away, he heard her call his name. He stopped. He turned. She was facing him on the sidewalk, with the streetlight falling sideways on her face, and said only that there was one thing she was sure of, that nothing she had done had been calculated, that she had gone to the Bras apartment because she had chosen to go, that she had stayed because she had chosen to stay, and that the rest had happened as things happen when two people stop pretending that life is simpler than it is. Renato stood looking at her for a moment. Then he said goodnight, and went home with the step of someone who has much to think about, but who is no longer lost within the thought. The days that followed were silent in a way Renato learned to distinguish as different from all previous silences. It wasn't the empty silence of the Bras apartment, where the nothing was just absence. It was a silence full of content, like the pause between a thunderclap and the next, where the air is still charged, but the storm has already passed far away. He worked. He arrived at the office at 8, as he had done since they signed the contract for the space, and Conceição arrived at 8:20, as was her habit. They said good morning, drank coffee, opened their computers. There were 2 reports to close and a new client to prospect in the South Zone. The life of the consultancy didn't stop for internal reorganizations, and this was, Renato discovered, a disguised grace. When the head wants to stay in a loop, working gives the body something concrete to do. They didn't talk about the Friday conversation, but there was a different quality in the air between them, as if something had expanded and was still finding a way to accommodate its new size. Conceição didn't press. He had said he needed time, and she had taken that seriously, which was an act of discreet love that he was only able to name as such a few days later. On Thursday of the following week, while he was reviewing a spreadsheet in the late afternoon, Renato stopped, put the computer in standby mode and said her name. She looked up from her notebook. He said he had thought a lot. He said he had been angry for a moment, not at her but at the situation, at the feeling that there were more layers than he could see, which was an old reflex of his own history, of having been deceived by people he knew and trusted. He said he had managed to separate that from her, that he had realized that what she had done, both the statement to the lawyer and the fact of having arrived first with the lunchbox and not with the information, was the mark of a person who acts out of integrity and not out of strategy. And he said he was fine, that they were fine, that there was something he wanted to build with her that went beyond the consultancy, and that he had said that before, but that now he was saying it again on the other side of a difficult week, which was different because things said after a test carry more weight than those said in a quiet moment. Conceição stood looking at him for a few seconds. Then she said, "That's good." They were 2 words, but there was in them a volume that she let fill the office space without needing anything else. In that same month, the Cavalcante Engenharia judicial process advanced in a way the lawyer had described as unexpectedly favorable. A portion of the assets that had been diverted was located through a financial trace that had been possible, among other factors, by a set of information provided by different sources throughout the months of the process. The result didn't return the company or the lost years, but it represented a partial recovery that allowed Renato to close the heaviest liabilities and exit the process without the weight of debts he had carried like a concrete block tied to his back. When the lawyer called with the news, Renato was in the office. He hung up the phone, stared at the wall for about 30 seconds, and then turned to Conceição and said in a few words what had happened. She listened, nodded once, and went back to what she was doing. There was no excessive celebration, no drama. It was simply one more item that had been resolved, and there were things to do. Renato stood looking at her and thought that it was exactly that posture towards life that had kept him in motion when everything inside him wanted to stop. In October, they expanded. They hired a second person full-time, a woman in her early 30s specialized in institutional communication who had responded to an ad Conceição had written in a post on the consultancy's social networks, which she had created and updated with a regularity that brought new contacts every week. With the new hire, it was possible to take on a larger client, a chain of popular health clinics that operated in 4 peripheral neighborhoods of São Paulo and needed a complete administrative reorganization to remain viable. It was the most ambitious project they had undertaken, and there was in it, for Renato, a dimension that hadn't existed in previous works. The clinics served a low-income population, which meant that organizing that structure was directly creating conditions for people without access to a health plan to have a service that worked. It was work with an impact he could see, not the abstract impact of square meters built in high-standard neighborhoods, but the impact that manifested in an appointment that worked, in a line that wasn't delayed, in a medical record that existed where there had only been a crumpled paper in a box. Conceição had proposed that client specifically because of that, and when Renato asked, in an afternoon team meeting, why she had sought out that segment instead of others with a higher financial margin, she replied that she had spent much of her life depending on public health services and knew what it was like when they worked poorly, and that now there was a chance to use what they knew to make them work better. There was no speech in that. It was just the logic of someone whose values had been formed in real experience and who now had the means to act on them. Renato listened to this and then looked at the new hire, who had noted something in her notebook and realized that he had built a team around a principle he hadn't articulated consciously, but that was present from the first moment: respect for the reality of things, without idealizations. In November, he visited his parents in Minas. It was the first in-person visit in more than a year. His mother had prepared a lunch that was, in volume and in care, the culinary version of everything she hadn't managed to say on the phone. His father, slower than Renato had kept in his memory, but with the same precise look as always, had sat with him on the porch after lunch and said, after a long silence, that he had been proud of the way his son had faced the fall, that it was easy to be good when everything was fine, that the test came when it wasn't. Renato had kept that phrase for weeks. In December, Conceição met Renato's parents during a visit she had made with him during the weekend. His mother had liked her immediately, with that instinctive approval of mothers who know how to recognize when someone is real. His father had talked with her for almost an hour about the history of São Luís, which he knew from a work trip years ago, and Conceição had been excited in a way Renato rarely saw her, telling about the Bahia de São Marcos and the downtown markets and the historical neighborhoods she hadn't forgotten, even after so many years in São Paulo. On the way back, on the interstate bus with the Minas night passing through the window, Renato said there was something he was thinking about. Conceição said it was dangerous when he used that tone, because it meant he had made a decision before letting her know. He said he wanted to grow the consultancy in the direction of the third sector, that there was potential in working with social organizations that needed administrative structure to expand the impact of what they did, but that didn't have the capital to hire large firms, that he had talked to the lawyer and the accountant about the possible pricing model. Conceição stood looking at him in the darkness of the bus and then said there was a coincidence she needed to tell, that she had noted, in the red notebook she still kept, an idea very similar to that one almost 2 months ago, that she had waited for the right moment to bring it up. Renato said it was impossible. She took the notebook out of her bag, opened it to the page, and pointed with her finger. He read by the dim light of the window illuminated by the highway and was quiet for a long moment. Then he looked at her and said it was scary how that worked between them. Conceição said it wasn't scary. It was simply what happened when two ways of thinking had similar values. The bus ran through the dawn toward São Paulo, and the two remained in silence for a while, she with her eyes closed and her head tilted slightly towards the window, he with his look outside and his hand that found hers in the dark of the seat without either of them having planned the gesture. The city was still far away. There was time. Vivian appeared on a February afternoon, 2 years after the morning Renato had opened the meeting room door and found the world he knew falling apart in silence. She appeared without warning, which was consistent with who she had always been, someone who entered spaces as if the right to enter were given, not earned. Renato was in the Ipiranga office when the secretary announced that there was a woman at reception who said she was an acquaintance and asked to speak with him. The secretary described her with involuntary precision. Beige coat, hair tied back, sunglasses. Renato knew before asking the name. Conceição was at the desk next to him. He said her name in a low voice. Conceição put her pen in the holder, looked at him and said she was going to get a coffee and would return when the time was right. She left without hurry, with the discretion of someone who knows when their presence is unnecessary and when it is indispensable, and who never confuses the two. Vivian entered. The elegance he had associated with her for 10 years had suffered an erosion that was impossible not to notice, not in appearance itself, which was still cared for, but in something underneath, an absence of solidity that had been there before. She sat in the client chair without being invited, which continued to be Vivian. She spoke for 20 minutes. The story she told had the texture of stories involving someone who believed a certain path would lead to one place and discovered it led to another completely different. Marcos had left the picture a few months after ending his involvement with her, and what had remained was a financial situation. She hadn't managed well because she had spent the last few years managing the appearance of a life instead of life itself. She apologized. She said she didn't expect anything, but there was one thing she needed to say, that she had made a huge mistake, not only with him, but with herself, and that there was some consolation in at least having the honesty to say that out loud to the person she had harmed most directly. Renato listened to her to the end, not with coldness, but with the specific distance of someone who had gone through a real process of processing and arrived in a place where anger no longer needs to make noise to exist. Then he said he heard her, that he took seriously what she was saying, and that he had spent a long time building something with what had remained, not over what he had lost, but from a real zero, and that this process had changed what he understood by success in a way that made it impossible to look at the past with the hatred that was there before. He said he forgave her. Not the word, not just the sound, but the real gesture, which is when you realize that the other person no longer has power over the story you are living, and that this is enough to let it go. Vivian stood looking at him for a moment, with an expression he couldn't completely classify, but which had something of relief and something of late recognition. She got up, thanked him, and left. The office remained silent for a few minutes. Conceição entered with 2 coffees, placed one on his desk without asking questions. He took the cup, looked at her and said only, "It's over." She nodded once and went back to her chair. In that same year, FC Consultoria Administrativa formalized the social division that had germinated in the Red Notebook and in the interstate bus conversations. The new branch was called FC Social, and it served non-profit organizations and community cooperatives with a pricing model that made the service accessible to those who most needed structure to exist. The first client had been an association of women seamstresses in Capão Redondo who needed help to become a formal cooperative. The second had been a professional training school in Jardim Angela. Renato and Conceição began to appear together at industry events, not as a couple flaunting a relationship, but as partners with a shared vision that manifested itself differently in each of them. Him with the technical precision of someone who knew the workings of large structures, her with the practical intelligence of someone who had learned to optimize resources where resources were scarce. There was a report published in a creative economy portal that described them as an unlikely model of partnership. The reporter had been curious about the consultancy's origin and had asked them to tell how it had started. Renato had answered that it had started with a lunchbox. The reporter had smiled, thinking it was a metaphor. It wasn't. In March of that year, 2 years and a few months after the afternoon, she had arrived at the Bras apartment with a metal lunchbox and the silent decision not to abandon someone just because the world had abandoned them. Renato asked Conceição to marry him. Not with drama, not with an audience, not with the kind of performance that had marked other phases of his life. It was on an ordinary night in the Ipiranga apartment, after the dinner they had made together, with the table still with the plates and her with her hair loose and him without a tie, and the city outside making the usual noise. He said he wanted to build the rest with her, that he had learned in the hardest way possible that the empires worth having are not the ones we accumulate to impress, but the ones we raise together with someone who remains when everything else disappears, and that she was the only person in his life who had remained without there being anything to gain from it, and that this fact alone would already be enough for him to know the answer was yes, even before asking the question. Conceição stood looking at him. Then she looked at the messy table and the plates that still needed washing. Then she looked back at him and said, "I know I was going to say yes, since before you knew you were going to ask." And she laughed, which was the kind of laughter that didn't need an explanation. The faucet in the Bras apartment was still dripping, probably, for some other tenant going through something he didn't know yet he would overcome. But here, in this kitchen with the plates on the table and the city outside, and Conceição Ferreira sitting across from him with the yes still in the air between the two, there was nothing dripping. There was only the specific silence of when life is being exactly what it should be. Renato Cavalcante had lost the empire. He had lost the cars, the apartment, the balance, the prestige, the friends who weren't friends. He had lost the illusion that respect is the same as admiration, and that admiration is the same as affection. And he had found at the exact bottom of all that something that no bank account had managed to buy for decades, someone who stayed, someone who saw him without the varnish and without the defense and without the title and without the power, and who chose to stay anyway. And that was, when all was said, the only wealth that cannot be taken by the bank. Dear listener, if Renato and Conceição's story touched something in you, if you recognized in one of them something of yourself or someone you love, then it fulfilled the purpose for which it was told. Our stories exist because we believe that what truly moves us is not what we accumulate, but what we preserve when we have nothing left to accumulate. If you've made it this far, you already know you have the breath for long stories, the ones that don't end in the first chapter, the ones that ask for patience and reward with something real. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any of the next ones, because there are many stories like this waiting to be told. Leave your like. It's small for you and huge for us. And tell us in the comments which moment of the story stayed with you. Every word you write there is a reason for us to continue here. Until the next story. End of the story.